Hey everyone, John from Nintendo Life here! And there was a time during the start of the 3DS era when Nintendo experimented with their game preservation. Usually, we get them exactly as they were, or we don't get them at all. But they introduced the 3D Classics range. This was a very short-running series of 6 games. But what was interesting is these weren't emulated. These were essentially remade from the ground up. So games such as Kirbys Adventure and Kid Icarus were essentially ported to the 3DS. So not only did they run in stereoscopic 3D, but there were a ton of other enhancements too. And while I can't show you the 3D effect, I definitely can show you why. These are the definitive ways to play these classic games. So without further ado, take it away, John with the microphone, who's an entirely different being. There he is. Give them a wave. Oh, he's friendly. This series was developed by Icarus, who you probably know from the 99 series, with games like Tetris 99 and Pac-Man 99 and... were there more? The runtime was fairly short. Excitebike debuted on June 6, 2011, and the final game, Kid Icarus, released on February 2nd, 2012, so just a few months. Developing these games was quite a challenge, and it seems the requirements didn't pay off. And that's unfortunate because this series had so much potential, and the lineup as it is pretty peculiar. But anyway, despite being native to the 3DS, what made these games so special? Let's start off with the first one being Excitebike, and you may know exactly what it is just by looking at it. Have you spotted it yet? Let's go into gameplay. How about now? Yeah, Excitebike was remade entirely in widescreen. So to get things running in stereoscopic 3D, they can't just take an NES game and have it magically work. In most cases, they were faithfully restored from the ground up. So Icarus went in and restored these games in their entirety, not a small undertaking. The gameplay in almost every single game is exactly as it was on the NES, but the surrounding elements can be really interesting. It's not just that Excitebike's in widescreen, but there's also new weather effects. Those stormy clouds were never in the NES game. The original Excitebike has just never looked or played better than this. One huge difference too is the track editor. In the original game, there was this very clunky interface where you go through the alphabet and have to sort of memorize what every single function is, whereas now you just view them and place them. There's even a ton of slots to save your tracks, whereas on the NES, you barely had anything. And while you can't see the 3D effect, take my word for it, it's really good. When you change the track you're on, that translates really well to a 3D effect. There's just so many layers visible and it looks great. But not every game had the same kind of changes. For instance, Kirbys Adventure has essentially no changes. This is the NES game in 4x3, but in 3D. So what's incredibly special about that? Well, if you let your memory take the steering wheel, then you'll probably think nothing at all. But if you go back to the NES Kirbys Adventure, you will see that there's a lot of slowdown. If there's more than one enemy sprite on the screen, then using some powers makes everything just come to a crawl. This is the case in all emulated versions, like the Wii, the Wii U, and so on. But because the 3D Classics version was ported to 3DS and is running natively on this platform, there's no slowdown. All these things that made the NES drag just aren't present on 3DS, and for that reason, this may be one of the most impressive ports of them all. It's not in widescreen, it doesn't change the visuals, but this makes Kirbys Adventure more playable than ever. So what's new in Kid Icarus? No, it's not that they're using the Famicom Disk System soundtrack, but they are. Let's change to NES a moment. And change back. Yeah, there's a background now. The entirety of Kid Icarus is no longer presented on a black screen. This was probably done to aid the 3D effect, as I imagine having a pit of darkness doesn't exactly give you layers, but it also changes the context of Kid Icarus. I mean, the story in the original is Pit is in the underworld and must make his way upwards to Skyworld. But would you know that without a manual? In 3D Classics, you're seeing Pit get further and further towards the Skyworld. You start off with these fiery pits as your backdrop, kind of showing you're in the underworld, but as you get higher and higher, things get a lot more natural. It's really great stuff, and it makes me wish that Metroid was part of this series. There's points in that game where level design is identical from room to room, and having some kind of distinguished backdrop would make the game so much more playable, but unfortunately the series was cancelled very shortly. And if you bought Uprising at launch, you'd even get Kid Icarus 3D Classics as a free download. It's a really brilliant version, and there's even a save feature, unlike the NES which relied on these long passwords. And of course, you can't have Nintendo re-releases without Urban Champion. Now, the weirdest thing here is this game out of all the games is the closest to being an actual remake. Not only is it in widescreen, not only does it utilize both screens, but they've changed the perspective. You can play in traditional 2D, but there's also this 3D side-on mode. No other game in this series changes the visual makeup like this, so it's so weird that Urban Champion, of all of them, pretty much had his own 3DS entry. I mean, it's Urban Champion, there's not much I can say about the gameplay itself, but how bizarre. And with that, that was the end of Nintendo's own lineup. Excitebike, Kid Icarus, Kirby's Adventure, and Urban Champion. What a lineup. There were 2 more games in this series though, B and Xevious. B's based on the Famicom version, and doesn't change a whole lot. It's still 4x3, although one thing I do like a lot is there's now rapid fire. On the Famicom, you mash that button over and over again, but on the 3DS, just hold it down. Feels great. The 3D effect's fantastic for this game too. You can really feel the height of your ship. You also occasionally have to bomb things on the floor, and that looks great too. And that's a very similar mechanic to Xevious. These are pretty similar games with shooting both in the foreground and the background, but the big difference in terms of these enhancements is Xevious is now in widescreen. It's kind of masked off with these clouds, but you can move into them, which changes the gameplay a lot. It's a really interesting version of the game. So this series was rather short-lived, but they gave us these 6 games essentially in their definitive forms. It's far more than just them being in 3D. These versions of Excitebike and Kirby's Adventure and Kid Icarus, they could come to Switch someday. There's a ton of value in them besides the 3D effect. The backgrounds, the screen ratio, their performance. These are the best ways to play these classic NES games, and they're stuck on the 3DS. Now, throughout this video, you may have been thinking, but John, there's way more than 6. There's Sonic 2, there's Afterburner 2, there's Fantasy Zone, there's way more that Sega's done. And while these are both called 3D classics, they aren't really the same series. Sega 3D Classics was published by Sega and developed by M2, whereas Nintendo 3D Classics was published by Nintendo and developed by Eureka. Even B and Xevious, which aren't Nintendo properties. But yes, these Sega games were developed in a very similar manner and were also really impressive. Games like Sonic 2 have no slowdown, whereas games like Fantasy Zone have widescreen. Both developers went above and beyond, and it's just something we don't see very often. Not emulation, but flat out ports and borderline remakes. So what do you guys think about the 3D Classics series? Did you play these yourself, or were you unaware of how enhanced they really are? Let us know in the comments below, and of course go to that subscribe button and view it in stereoscopic 3D, and we'll see you next time. Bye everyone.